Do you ever wake up and think about democracy and democratization in developing countries? No? Well, maybe you should, because it's very interesting, very important. Today I want to talk about two pretty big words, democracy and democratization. Why? Well, over time, democratization has become an important factor in today's goals of development in developing countries. It has become so important that whether funders of development projects will give money to certain developing countries hinges on whether these countries make progress in becoming more democratic. In other words, no democratization, no money from the donors to help a developing country and its people. So, yes, the international community agrees that democracy is important and that democratization should take place. But what even is a democracy? What does democracy actually mean? To find out, I asked around.
Für mich ist Demokratie freie Wahlen und eine absolute Gewaltenteilung.
In my opinion, democracy doesn't exist without capitalism.
Für mich bedeutet Demokratie, dass ich in meinem Land mitbestimmen kann, was passiert.
I believe that a democracy needs a good education system.
As you can see, there is no single and universally acknowledged definition of democracy. Essentially everyone, from scholars and policymakers to economists and individual citizens, they all have their own individual definition of what a democracy is. We just need to look at the democracies that already exist today to see how many forms of democracy are out there. There are constitutional monarchies, like the UK, or parliamentary democracies, like Germany. Then there are presidential democracies, like the United States. There's little dispute that the US is a democracy, but their electoral system allows someone to become president despite losing the popular vote in the national election. The institutional setup of the Electoral College trumps the voice of the people. So the question remains, who decides which form of democracy should be implemented in a developing country? And how should this democratic setup be reached? How should democratization be approached? Of course, there are just as many democratization approaches as definitions of democracy out there, but I would like to share with you the following three.
The modernization approach focuses on correlations between economic and social factors that are linked to democracy. These correlations are universal and linear. Universal means that they are true for all countries, and linear means that, for example, if there are many telephone connections in a country, there's much democracy. It has been recognized that some correlations are only partly universal because of regional differences. A strong middle class is also needed, as it supports democratic and moderate political parties and criticizes extremist groups. The transition approach sees the political elites to be the agents for democratic change, through their choices and initiatives. They identify 4 different phases. The first phase is characterized by national unity and the sense of a common political identity. The second, preparatory phase, involves political struggle between opposed groups. In the third phase, called decision phase, the elite compromises and accepts to put some democratic rules into operation. The last phase, the habituation phase, starts when these democratic rules have become habit, and the old political elite is replaced by a new generation of political elite who are not only used to the democratic rules, but also believe in them. The structural approach centers on the change of the structures of the state, class, and transnational power. But don't hold your breath. These changes are only gradual and may even take centuries. Fans of this approach say that a democracy only works when there is a balance of class power. Transnational movement of ideologies and cultures and the end of international tensions can also be beneficial for democratization.
So far, we have seen that the difficulties of defining democracy and how to approach democratization are the underlying issues of what to measure. But that's not all. Questions about how to measure democratization are just as important and difficult.
Many democracy indices are made up of a long list of indicators. This has advantages and disadvantages. The more indicators you use, the more detailed your index, and the less likely you are to leave out factors that influence how democratic a country is. However, it also makes such an index difficult to use, as many of the things measured cannot be directly linked back to democratization. But if you use fewer and broader indicators, you risk not being able to reveal things that are unique to a country. The particularities of each country are a challenge when you want to compare countries with each other. You can only do a cross-country comparison when you use the same indicators and the same way of measuring them for every country you look at. But two countries that have the same rank in an index could in fact have fundamental elements that vary, and the quality of democracy in these two countries may not actually be the same, even though they are ranked the same. So maybe we should look at how a single country has changed over time, rather than trying to compare different forms of governance with each other. But even when we only look at one country, it's not as easy as you might think. It is generally agreed upon that the electoral and the decision-making process should be included to a certain degree. But when you expand the factors you are looking at to include a very wide and broad range of issues, such as social changes, it becomes difficult to say who or what actually caused this change. Maybe it is completely unrelated to democratization. And you should also not just focus on policy outcomes, because even a good policy can be made by an undemocratic government. Once you have decided which indicators to include, you have to think about the scale of democracy you want to use. When you want to have a clear cut and look at how many full democracies exist in the world, then a binary scale, democratic and undemocratic, is useful. But when you want to find out how the quality of democracy has changed in a country, a more varied scale is much more helpful. In this way, you can also better find differences between democracies such as Japan, the US, or Sweden. Most indices use statements by experts to make an assessment, because it's cheaper and they have a better understanding about policy and governance issues. But experts don't necessarily reflect the population's view. And this is the advantage of citizen or firm surveys, is they ask the people who are actually affected by the policies. In both types of surveys, the views expressed are subjective, and it's even more problematic when experts and individuals don't say their honest opinions because they have to fear negative consequences if they criticize the government in any way.
I think throughout this video it has become very clear that measuring democracy and democratization is incredibly difficult. Already defining democracy seems impossible. There are several diverse ways to approach democratization, and questions about the actual measurement are certainly not easily answered. It doesn't look like there will be a universal definition of democracy, a common approach to democratization, and a perfect measurement index anytime soon. So what even is the conclusion here? With this video, I wanted to show you that there are decisions about developing countries and democracy that carry far and long-reaching consequences. Some donors don't want to give any money to developing countries when they haven't made any progress in democratization. The choices about foreign aid for development are based on democracy and governance indices. Yes, and all these indices face the problems I've talked about. So it is important to use these indices carefully, especially when a country's development might partly depend on it. But I also hope that this video has been thought-provoking and just makes you think about issues that are often neglected. Maybe from now on you will wake up in the morning and do think about things like democracy, climate change, or overfishing.